Hi, everyone.
Where are you all?
Hello.
There you are.
In this new world, it takes such a long time to get all your monitors and your audio and
I
everything.
know. And then, like, where's the thing I wanted to share? There it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Are we back at campus in the fall?
Good question.
We don't know yet.
There. Oh, look, there's Dr. Franke. Hi. So the question is, are we going to be on campus in the fall? And the answer is we don't know for sure. The conversations are around various possibilities. Some classes may be on campus, but there's only 3 rooms that are large enough to allow for social distancing. So, and then there are some folks who aren't comfortable with being on campus. There's some folks that have not gotten a vaccine. There's all kinds of questions and that sort of thing. And we don't know what's going to happen over the summer, right? So if things continue to progress the way that they seem to be progressing, in terms of more people getting vaccinated and the corona infections going down, we will probably have the option of being in person. There are also several classes. I'm thinking of this one in particular, this move, perhaps for the MTS colloquium, which is on mysticism and spirituality, which I think will be a great class, of being a kind of hybrid format where we'll meet in class. So we actually, I mean, to me, having met some of you in person, I've seen you in 3 dimensions as opposed to this, right? And it makes a very big difference in my experience of how well I know you. And, you know, are you tall? Are you thin? Are you, you know, do you have pants on? I mean, there's all kinds of things that we don't get to know about each other that, I mean, kind of silly, but there's all kinds of stuff going on that we don't get to know when we're not in person. So the idea is to have some kind of, and I think that's a great idea, to have some kind of hybridness so we can share the classroom. And we can also have some time when we actually are in person. And then some time that we would be in the Zoom room. The systematic theology will most likely be in person, although I'm experimenting with doing what Scott C. calls a flipped classroom, where he creates videos for people to watch with him giving a lecture. Mine would be a little more like, here's a PowerPoint and here's some points, and because I'm not going to wear a 3-piece suit and lecture. I don't know if that's what he does or not, but and then so people would watch that, and that might be an hour, and then we would maybe just Zoom in for another hour, hour and a half, and have conversations about it. So that's an option. I haven't made absolute decisions yet, but I do think that the systematic, if it's possible to be in person, will most probably be in person most of the time, if not all the time. The other class, I think, may be hybrid. And I encourage persons who are interested in the spirituality, mysticism and spirituality. I think it's going to be a really interesting class. And anybody who's interested in knowing more about research and thinking more critically about sources, it would be very helpful for you too. It's an MTS colloquium as well. So, long answer to your question. So I want to welcome John Franke here. But before we begin, are there's James, there's Jackie, there's Adrian. Okay. What I'd like you to do is, we usually begin, Dr. Franke, we usually begin with a kind of meditation. So instead of what we usually do, what I'd like you to do is, this is a little bit different. So it's a, I guess what you'd call do you call it a cartoon or? Anyway, so can everyone see it? Yes, no, maybe? You want it to go, okay, that was
Yes.
that. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is just kind of reflect upon this. And I'd like you to do some breathing. I'm just going to tell you what we're going to do and then we'll do it. And then meditate on the meaning of the cartoon. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to you. Maybe it's just silly. But maybe it does say something to us about the nature of truth, the nature of the divine mystery, something that is beyond our understanding, and how the way that we approach that has a big impact upon how we name it and what we do with it. So I'm going to invite you to reflect upon that. We'll just have a few minutes. So I'm going to keep this up, and you can take a few moments to just bring yourself into a centered space. Breathing. Maybe you can close your eyes gently if that feels okay, and just to attend to the sensations in your body. See if you can quiet the mind. And when new thoughts come in, just wave at them and let them pass. You might slowly open your eyes, and if it's easier for you to reflect upon that without looking at the image, that's fine as well. Whatever works for you. And just take a few moments, reflect upon those questions. What does it tell you about truth? What does it say to you, your response to it, say about truth, about divine mystery, about that which is beyond our understanding, and how we approach truth, divine mystery, and that which is beyond our understanding. And slowly start to come back into the space. I wonder if you might reflect upon the questions that I asked you to meditate on. What does it tell you? Or what ideas come up from looking at this? Maybe even what do you see when you look at that?
I feel like it's the guy on the left-hand side that just says God, he just has faith. And the other guy is like me, who's trying to solve it all out and figure it out and work my head around it. And it's not, there's something just peaceful about just having faith and not trying to answer it all.
Mm.
And plus all the math just brought back bad feelings. So that kind of associates too, like working at it so hard is just too much. It's not what we're meant to do.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
I kind of look at it as in trying to describe the same thing in two different languages, like the spiritual essence and then like maybe the physical, but at the same time, I don't understand anything in that math bubble at all, but at the same time, there's like this spirituality of mathematics in this, because you're trying to describe the indescribable in some ways, even as he tries to figure out the formula of the moon, but there's the sense of wonder that is shared between both the spiritual side and the physical side. So I kind of see two sides of the same, or one side of same coin, as it were. So it's two languages trying to describe the same thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
When I took a look at it, what came to my mind was just the many ways, basically as what truth to me, or truth from that cartoon, is just the many ways that God chooses to reveal God's self. So it could be through nature, someone observing the moon, or someone observing nature and saying it's God. And then someone else solving this ridiculously outrageous math problem, coming up with a truth, but both are representative of God somehow revealing truth of God's self to the individual.
Yeah, I like that. I like all of them. Yeah, it just struck me as an interesting cartoon, and particularly given the nature of what we're talking about in terms of what does it mean to talk about truth? Truth as manifold, truth as related to the interpretation. Dr. Franke is going to share with us from his book, Manifold Witness, which you might get in, even if you hadn't read the book or parts of the book, you'd get a sense of there's something manifold going on here. No, don't step on no. Sorry, she wants to walk across the keyboard, and you never know what might happen if that happens. Over there. Okay. And then that's Tangelo okay, I'm going to have to deal with her in a second, because she's just like, she is wanting to take a bath in my water. But at any rate, so I think these are interesting issues. And as you'll see, Dr. Franke and I might have a slightly different view of discussing the diversity of truth, or the diversity of approaches to truth. But I don't know, I haven't heard his discussion lately, because sometimes we're more in agreement, sometimes we're having a little bit of difference. Yeah, you can see the Whiteheadian connection, and then Suhaki is going to go in a sort of different direction as we will approach divinity and diversity. We'll see that going in a different direction as well. So I want to introduce Dr. Franke, but I realize I know who he is, but I think you actually even have a different job than you had before, and I don't really know where you went to school, but he's a really interesting theologian who's made some changes and gone in different directions throughout his theological career. And so we're glad that he's here in Indianapolis, although he could be Zooming from Rome, who knows?
No, I'm still here.
Okay,
Yeah.
So I'd like to introduce Dr. Franke, the author of the book that we're reading for today. Dr. Franke, please, you can share anything about yourself that you'd like to.
Okay.
No.
Well, thanks. And you can take care of, was it Tangelo?
Tangelo, yes. I
Tangelo,
need
yeah, okay. Yeah, well, good to be with you. Yeah, I am in Indianapolis still. This is behind me is in Milner Chapel at Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis. Here's my other favorite image that I use when I'm at staff meetings at church. Here, I'll just show this one. And probably this is more church. In some ways, this is more church to me than church, but okay, I'll leave this one up.
Is that, which field is that?
So that's Crosley Field in Cincinnati, which is now no longer exists, but I saw my first game there on August 4th, 1969 with my dad. And I've been a Reds fan ever since. I'm a season ticket holder. So I traipse down to Cincinnati regularly to watch the Reds.
All right.
I'm a theologian in residence at Second Presbyterian Church, and I'm also affiliate professor of theology at CTS. So I taught different courses there. And I also adjunct at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena and Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. So I've got the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest covered. But yeah, let me just talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then we can talk about it. Really, three things. That cartoon is perfect. I mean, it really sets up one of the ways that got me started, which was a frustration as a theology student and then a doctoral student and then teaching. I found myself just getting really frustrated with all the different absolute answers that people came up with and insisted on being right, and all the arguments about the nature of God. You know, what's the human problem? How are we saved from that problem? Who is Jesus? How do we relate to other religions? And I just got really frustrated at the intractable nature of the answers that so many different people gave. It seemed like everybody knew the right way. And I was always the kind of person, I always said, some people walk into a room with people with 100 different opinions and they think they're right and everybody else is wrong. I wasn't like that. I was the kind that walked into a room and I had ideas, but then I'd meet somebody and say, well, what do you think? And they'd share something. I'd think, oh, that's pretty interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. So by personality, I found the kind of the absolutism frustrating. So that was one piece. Another was my spiritual director one day. She had this and still has this incredible knack of being able to listen to me talk about my life and speak into it in ways that sort of are like a lightning bolt going across the sky, illuminating things that I had never seen before in my own life. And one day I said to her, you know, I'm just amazed at the way you're able to consistently do that. I said, because I'm pretty thoughtful and I turn things over and over and try to look at them from every angle. And it amazes me the way you come up with new angles. And her response, I never forgot. She said, yeah, I can see that. You're very introspective. But even when you try to look at it from all the different angles that you try to look at it from, you can still only do that from your perspective. And that was another, you know, kind of one of these aha moments. Like, no matter how much I try to see things from different perspectives, I'm still locked in my perspective. And the third one was a conversation I had with a Black pastor who was a friend of mine. And we were meeting together regularly to talk about James Cone. And one day in a conversation, we got to talk about integration, and he got really quiet. And it was one of those contexts where you're talking with somebody, you can just feel like something went wrong, even though no one said anything. And so I finally asked him, I said, you know, I feel like this conversation, something turned and it doesn't feel good. Am I right? Or is that just me? And he said, no, you're right. he said, I'm not sure I want to tell you because I don't want to hurt our friendship. And I said, I hope you can. And he said, okay. He said, every time I hear a white person talk about integration, I think, oh God, don't take the Black church away from me too. He said, because as long as things stay the way they are, John, your integration is just the loss of my tradition. And that was, again, I'd never thought about that before. I always thought that, of course, integration would be a great thing. But as he pointed out, when you put things in a collective melting pot, good things are always lost. And so really those kind of three things are background to why I wrote the book. When I wrote it, I was teaching at an evangelical theological seminary of a more conservative persuasion. And so this was my attempt to try to continue to open things up a bit. And so, yeah, I tried to write a book that tried to say, look, I think we can still be faithful to Scripture, faithful to the tradition of the church, committed to some common theological resources, and still come to a conclusion that diversity is what God intended. And so I wrote the book and tried to, talk about a theology of Christian pluralism. I've actually taught this course now at CTS a couple of times. Maybe we'll do it again someday soon. But basically, that's my argument, is that if we think about who God is in classic Christian discourse, Trinitarian, well, then you've got plurality in the divine life. If we take and think about the authoritative nature of Scripture, which, as far as I know, most, if not all, Christian traditions still continue to affirm, although they mean different things by that, we still have a set of texts that are very diverse. And so if they are in some sense true, then you have the plurality of truth. And even if we think about the nature of revelation, I try to make an argument that is characterized by diversity. So the book is sort of a defense of that pluralism and toward a theology of Christian pluralism. And I just want to comment quickly on Helene or Dr. Russell's comment, because I think she's right. Part of my assumption is that you can get to this from different angles. And if the thesis is true that plurality or pluralism is the nature of God's design, then that's exactly what we should expect. So I get there through a kind of reformed theology that draws on Karl Barth and John Calvin and Friedrich Schleiermacher. And other people will get there through different theological traditions and perspectives. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. So coming back to the cartoon, which I think is a great way to get into this, I would say, yeah, just imagine that same cartoon, but now not just with two people, but with hundreds or thousands of people staring at that reality and talking about it in different ways. My view is that that's the only way we can talk about it. So part of the challenge for all of us is obviously to come to appreciate those differences, but also ask, what do things like faith formation look like when we're assuming that none of us sort of has the corner on the market of truth? Last thing I'll say, and we can go where you want, I don't think that this means that everything has to be true, right? So you can completely affirm a kind of an infinite kind of plurality and still say some things are wrong. And so the analogy I've used since somebody gave it to me a number of years ago is, how many numbers are there, whole or otherwise, between 6 and 10? Well, there are an infinite number of numbers between 6 and 10, but one of them is not 12. 12 is not one of the numbers between 6 and 10. So I think that we are still in a position in adopting this kind of approach to be able to say some things are wrong. And I think that's really important, especially today when there's lots of people making lots of claims about Christianity and other religious traditions that make them appear to be exclusive or violent, that I think it's right to challenge. And so this will be the last thing I'll say. One of the phrases I use at the end of the book, and I don't know if you read the whole thing, is this phrase, bold humility. So I think that from my perspective as religious leaders, there are places where it is appropriate to be and necessary to be bold and to challenge certain ideas as outside the bounds of what we believe the truth to be. But in that context, we always have to manifest also an appropriate humility that lets people know that we don't think we have the market cornered on truth. I will end with a quote from Karl Barth, Dr. Russell's favorite theologian. Usually she says, if we're in person, she usually says boo about this point. And that's okay. But Karl Barth said, thank you. Yes, thank you. Karl Barth said, as Christians, we must speak about God. However, we are human and so cannot. We must acknowledge our obligation, both our obligation and our inability, and in that very way, give God glory. So that's sort of what I mean by bold humility. Okay. Well, I could go on and on, but I think that's enough from me for now. Where would you like to take the conversation? I don't know if Helene wants to say some things, add some things, or you guys want to jump in. But let's talk.
Thank you, Dr. Franke. I appreciate the quick summary of your book, and I'm not sure if you've gone in different directions or are focused on different themes, because I haven't I haven't continued to be caught up on your articles or books that you've been writing, but I'm not even going to say anything about Karl Barth. How about that?
Okay. By the way, new biography of Karl Barth just is coming out May 4th, and I downloaded it onto my Kindle today. And it has the most recent salacious details about all the menage a trois that existed in the Barth household.
Oh, yeah, the Trinitarian relationship there.
Yes, exactly.
The two women and him. Yes, well, there's a nice, I will just make the plug that there is a nice biography of Soren Kierkegaard, my guy, who, a lot of people who like Barth like Kierkegaard, and a lot of people who like Kierkegaard hate Barth. So yes, there's different ways of reading these great thinkers and theologians. And I love the fact that you have Barth and Schleiermacher, and you used it in the sentence together and nothing happened to you.
Yes.
Like lightning did not come out of
and Calvin. And Calvin.
You put Calvin in there too?
Yeah, Calvin, Barth, and Schleiermacher.
Yeah, well, I can see Calvin with Barth, but I'm going to put him in, okay, and Bonhoeffer and Calvin. All right, I'm just taking notes. Yes. I asked folks to come up with a question or two from your reading. So unless there's anything that you would like, anybody would like clarification from what Dr. Franke has just said, or if you really want to hear Dr. Franke and I continue to argue about Barth and Kierkegaard, so I'm going to encourage you to bring up your questions.
I can make a further defense of Karl Barth now.
While they're figuring out their questions, I will say that I think one of the biggest difference between me and Barth is that I think, while I agree that God is certainly a mystery and beyond what we can know for certain, I do think that we do and can know something from God, that we do actually experience divine engagement with us. And it may be particular to us, given my process theology perspective, but it's not that, I mean, God includes mystery, but God is not all mystery. Nor do I think God is only revealed in the New Testament. I think that God is revealed in a lot of other ways, and that we have a capacity to engage with God in a way in which we can know we're engaging with God without necessarily checking it with what Paul says in the New Testament. So
Yeah.
I will say that.
You know, interesting. I would agree with all of that. And I think one of the we don't want to do this on Karl Barth, but I think Barth has been massively misread by some Barthians. And so if any of you were interested in that, I would encourage you to pick up the stuff that connects Karl Barth to liberation theology or Karl Barth to postmodern thinking, and just see that there are different readings. There are different Barths out there. In fact, you know, there was an article published not that long ago in First Things called Barth Wars. Get it? Star Wars, Barth Wars. And it was basically this big debate on how to read Karl Barth. And so at some level, I think, yeah, I got to some of this that I'm talking about through Karl Barth as well as Calvin and Schleiermacher. But the point really isn't what Karl Barth thought. It's, you know, what we think.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think there are, and, you know, there's even been some interesting work, Helene, I don't know if you've seen it, connecting Barth with process thought. I think
a friend of mine she loved Barth. She was from Canada. She loved Barth. She loved him. And I did not like him. I was Tillich. She was Barth.
Yeah.
But she was a process theologian before I was. But at any rate.
Fair enough. So what do you guys think? Jump in here.
I have a question and I'm not very good at the computer, so I can't get back to the questions I wrote out to remember. But I have a question for something you said that I actually have a problem with. So funny story is I have not read process theology before, which is very strange. And both of my mentors, when I was talking to them, I'm asking them what theology they follow. And I said, you know, I read this and went, wow, I connect with all this. They're like, we could have told you that's your theology, Mary Beth. We just had no idea you didn't have a name for it. You've always talked the process theology as long as we've known you. But one of the things people say to me all the time is, yeah, but Mary Beth, something has to be wrong for you, because I am that person that will listen to anybody's point of view. I don't agree, but I can take in people's point of view. I can hear, I meet people where they're at. I don't always agree with them though, but I'm so I am open to hear, and I love hearing. It's something I enjoy very much. How do you get across to people that, no, I don't agree with everything just because I'm willing to listen and hear? How do you do that?
Well, you talk with them. I mean, and there's places where you say, I don't agree with that. I have, Helene and I have done that over meals and in classrooms. And, I think there are ways of still appreciating other points of view and not sharing them. I think the key, at least, I won't say the key, but one of the ways that for me, that it's important is to come back to that realization that even when I don't agree with something, that isn't necessarily a final judgment on the rightness or wrongness of that thing I don't agree with, but it's also about my perspective. And so I think that's part of why I love that cartoon at the beginning of class. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of angles of vision that are helpful that people aren't able to share. Elizabeth Johnson's got a book. It's probably been out, maybe 5 years now, maybe, called Quest for the Living God. And she's just talking about Christian perspectives, new perspectives in Christianity, not talking anything about other religious traditions on the doctrine of God and has 12 different chapters of different approaches to thinking about the divine in the Christian tradition, which are fascinating. I guarantee you, if you got all the people from all those different chapters together, they wouldn't agree. But her point is there's something that's helpful about understanding that diversity. Now, of course, she got in trouble with the magisterium of the Catholic Church for writing that book, but that tells you something about different ways of thinking about church. So that's what I'd say. You converse, you talk, and, the phrase I use in Manifold Witness is, the thesis is that there is a irreducible plurality that is part of the truth. Irreducible means it doesn't matter how long you talk about it, the plurality will remain. And my belief is that is the way God has set things up. So I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, it does. And for me, that is part of the beauty of it. I would be bored if we all like, okay, this is how it is, and be done with it.
Yes. Yeah, the way I say it in the book is that this plurality or this pluralism is part of the divine blessing. It's not a problem to be overcome. And the trouble with us humans, is the mess we tend to make of God's beautiful plurality when we want to try to take it over and control it. And so I think that happened. This is stuff that I wouldn't have said in that book written in 2009. But I think even the move to, and again, I don't want to get in too much trouble here, but even the move to canonize a set of texts as the authoritative collection is, I regard now, a move against the appropriate plurality of the church, so that folks in the church that read the Gospels written in Aramaic were told, you can't read those anymore. They are not considered authoritative because we're only going to use ones written in Greek. Well, who gave those people the microphone? They had the power, so they took it. That was part of Rome's kind of engagement. But why aren't things like the Gospel of Thomas and the Syriac Gospels that were reflective of Christian communities, legitimate expressions of the divine in the world? So, I think I can work within the canon of the New Testament and the Old Testament to make the case that I'd want to make. But on the basis of that case, I would also then include other texts that aren't part of that canon as appropriate manifestations of human experience with God.
I really appreciate this thought, because I'm seeing this in certain circles of where I'm serving at right now. There seems to be a pushback in trying to basically bury this diversity. There's been a couple of books that have come out recently that really kind of hit against progressive Christianity and everything else that represents it. But here, it brings me back to what I learned last semester in Christian history, that we are a very diverse movement, and we have so many different ways of understanding, and it's just it was very affirming to read it. One thing that you wrote struck me as kind of Wesleyan, though. You coming from a Calvinist perspective, but the unity of the church is not to be sought merely as an end in itself, but rather as a unity centered on the truth of the gospel and the word of God as it is worked out in the mission to the world. It kind of sounds like Wesley's in all things, in essentials, unity. And I can't remember the whole quote, but in essentials, unity, and in everything else, this loosely held ambiguity, bold humility, of being able to share space and not worry about whether or not we're all on the same page with those non-essentials. And so it was just really affirming to read that, because that's I'm seeing that war that we want to wage over orthodoxy when we don't quite, we want to take one specific version of it or stream of it and say this is the one, but
Right.
it's just impossible to say that is the one when there was 12 others on right next to it. So
Yes. Yeah. And I think this, the part of the case that you and I and others who would share this designation of progressive Christianity have to make, in my judgment, is that the Reformation talked about going back to the sources, ad fontes, right? And that I think I want to make the case that this position is actually more orthodox, more faithful to the sources than the arguments of those who are moving in directions that are much more shaped by empire and, going back to Rome and Christendom. And that, these arguments that we're talking about actually are more faithful. They're more faithful to the way of Jesus. They're more faithful to what we see in Scripture. So I would call myself still even not just a progressive Christian, but a progressive evangelical.
Yeah,
That is a progressive ordered around the gospel, which we're told in Scripture is good news to all people, not just the select few that are in the circle of supposed orthodoxy.
right.
So, we can talk about the Christianization of Rome, but I'm a lot more worried about the Romanization of Christianity. What happened to Christianity when Rome made that faith its official religion? And Rome didn't do that so that Christianity could get in its face and say, you guys are doing things wrong. Rome did that so that Christianity would baptize the policies of empire, which are utterly contrary to the way of Jesus.
Right.
We still have to make that case.
Yeah. And the whole Council of Nicaea was to squash some of that diversity anyway.
Right. Yes.
Because everybody needed to get on the same page.
Right.
You couldn't handle
so said the empire.
Right. Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
One last question I have is, since I'm taking your Romans course in the fall, do I need to dig up my copy of Barth's Romans book for that class?
Well, you could. We won't be using that in class, but that's
Okay.
a great. I mean, what I love about Barth there is the way he blows up traditional readings, and so what we're going to try to explore in class is, we'll talk about the traditional reading, but we're going to look at other ways of reading Romans than just the standard, so-called orthodox way of reading. And Barth was brilliant at that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just to add to the flavor here, I like Barth in his book on Romans. I think he goes a different direction after that. It feels to me like it's a very different Barth, but I like what he says in Romans. I think that's where he quotes Kierkegaard a lot too.
Yeah. One of the things you have to remember about Karl Barth as his career developed is he ends up a lot of his formative work in the dogmatics happens during the rise of Nazism.
Yeah.
And he's watching the German church capitulate to Hitler.
Yeah.
And so he's seeing, which he regards as one, and I think, we have to be fair. There's one of the dangers of connecting culture to our theology, which I believe in. I mean, I've written extensively on that culture is a source for theology, but one of the things you have to watch out for is that the culture doesn't sort of take over the theology. And Barth sees that happening right in front of his eyes. He watches people like Paul Althaus and Gerhard Kittel, author of the Theology, become Nazis and support the extermination of Jewish people in the name of Jesus Christ. And he says, my God, what's happened here? So I think that some of the lines he draws are probably overdrawn, but because of what he's facing, maybe it gets more understandable.
I'll let it stay there. because I'd really like us to discuss your book and not more. So please, folks, share your questions.
By the way, it's okay to disagree with me too. I mean, you can say, hey, I didn't like this. Those are the most fun things to talk about if you've got them.
Can you discuss your, I read the book as the Trinity is the truth for you. So then it's also another sign of the plurality, which could make our faith deeper when we consider all three. Can you expound on that a bit more?
Yeah. So yeah, that basic argument there is that one of the central symbols of the Christian faith is the Trinity. And traditionally, the argument has always, the tendency has been to talk about the way the three are one. So how are they, one God, unity? But I think it's also just as legitimate and necessary to talk about the ways that the three are plural, and that this kind of diversity is in the life of God according to the deepest symbols of the Christian tradition. And one of the things that I try to talk about in the book is the way that means that the love of God made known in Jesus is not an assimilating love in which the one engages the other and tries to make it the same. So that in the life of God from all eternity, according to the classic Christian tradition, there has been plurality and difference in the very life of God. And that God's living with that plurality and difference is, in its anthropomorphic language, but the total giving of self for the sake of the other. So when the New Testament talks about Jesus Christ crucified before the foundation of the world, I would take that language to mean this kind of cruciform, self-giving life for the sake of the other is characteristic of the divine life in plurality from the very beginning. And that's what Jesus comes into the world calling on people to live, right? Instead of living for yourself, give yourself up for the sake of the other. And in this case, even those who are your enemies. So I would take that all the way back to that's the expression of what the life of God looks like in Trinity. I actually write a bi-monthly column in a publication from the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and this month's column, the one that's coming out right around Trinity Sunday, is on the Trinity-shaped love of God, and talking about how this very model is an example for us of how we are to live with other folks, and this plurality that God has enjoyed throughout eternity is both a model of what God's created and then how we're to engage with that diversity. So I don't know if is that enough, or do you have further question?
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great. One of my favorite quotes is by Laman Sana, who was an African theologian and who taught for years at Yale. He's since passed on. And one of the happiest days, by the way, was when I asked him to write an endorsement for the book. And he said, I am in agreement with John Franke, And I was, I thought, okay, sometimes you write books, you think, if I can make certain people happy, then I'll be happy no matter what my critics say. And he was one of those for me. And I had some great times with him before he passed away. But one of the quotes from him that I like, he says, for all of us, differences in culture and language and tradition are difficult and problematic. He said, but for God, pluralism is the cornerstone of the universal design. And I love that language because it says that yeah, we can talk about something universal, but the nature of that universal is pluralism. That pluralism is the cornerstone of what God is up to. And so it's not, again, coming back to what we've talked about a couple times, this to me is not capitulation to the spirit of the age. This is recovering the deepest impulses and concerns of the Christian tradition, which sadly have been, lost or obscured because I think of the influence of Christendom on this Christian faith.
Could you talk a little bit more about Jesus, the distinction between Jesus being sent to hell by God or descending, and just the use of creeds?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'd want to say I think creeds are not a bad thing. It's what we do with them. So, in my Reformed tradition, we practice what I would call open confessionalism. So, we think that it is important to say to the world at a given place and time what we think the truth is and what needs to be said. But what we don't think is that we say that once and for all time. So in my Presbyterian USA denomination, our Constitution includes a book of confessions. And we have 12 different documents that we identify as a set of faithful confessions, which actually have disagreements amongst them and tensions, but include things like the Barmen Declaration, which Karl Barth was the principal author, and here are things that need to be said at the time of the rise of National Socialism. The most recent edition is the Belhar Confession, written in South Africa at the height of apartheid. And so, I think it is good to say what we believe. In that way, I think, I know there's an anti-confessional strain in the church that says, look, no creed but the Bible. The trouble is the Bible gets construed in so many different ways. That's not all bad, of course. In many ways, it's good. But sometimes we need to say, here is something that is so central to our commitment that we need to make a stand on this and, take the consequences. So Karl Barth and Barmen, Barth was kicked out of Germany, and some of the people that supported that were executed. In South Africa, some of the authors of the Belhar Confession experienced state persecution because of their opposition to that policy. So yeah, I think it is important to do that, realizing that the mistake we make is when we say, well, the Apostles' Creed is absolute, we can never question that, or the Nicene Creed or something like that. I see them as valuable statements in the ongoing plurality of confessions about the nature of the truth. So James Cone, in one of his books, says something like, I don't want to detract one iota from the Nicene Creed. I value it, I think it's important, but I do want to say, this is Cone speaking, that the questions addressed in amongst the authors of the Nicene Creed are not the questions that Black people are wrestling with in America today. And that, just saying that Jesus is homoousia with the Father is not a helpful statement of Christology for the Black church as it wrestles with white supremacy in North America. His words are, the questions that Black folk are asking are more like, is Jesus in the slave cabin or only in the master's house? Well, that's a very, and I love his point. He's not saying Nicaea is bad or we should detract from it, but that in no way does it answer all the questions that need to be wrestled with. So that kind of, for me, Jesus comes and invites us to bear witness to the truth as best we can, but we understand our limitations, and new times, new situations call for new confession. I love Cone. I mean, in fact, I say to people, my theology is sort of a mix of Karl Barth and James Cone. I think he is, captures the spirit of the gospel, I think, with extreme helpfulness. And interestingly, early in his career, although he moved away from this, he says the most influential theologian, he says, or one of the most influential in his earliest work, was Karl Barth. Later in his life, he said, he kind of moved away from that. I personally would say I don't think he needed to, that Barth could still have been a helpful interlocutor, although he ceased to find him so. I think in part because Barthians got so critical of him, but I don't think they needed to be. And if you think about, Gary Dorian, who's at Union Theological Seminary now, has written a fantastic book on Karl Barth called The Barthian Revolt in Modern Theology, which I think is a beautiful expression of the ways in which sort of Barth's Reformed theology connects with classic liberation theology.
As I was reading, I came across something that I'd like you to elaborate on, if you would. And I'll just read the quote here from your text. It says, it needs to be added here that while the one faith takes on multiple expressions, not all expressions of the one faith are appropriate. The problematic nature of some expressions of the faith points to the importance of the work of deconstruction discussed in the previous chapter in the ongoing process of assessing the proclamation and practices of the church. I'm really interested if you would elaborate on what would be deemed appropriate versus what would be deemed inappropriate, and who determines that distinction.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so let me take an easy one. So we've been talking about the Christianity that emerged in Nazi Germany and the Christians that connected Christian faith to the policies of National Socialism and the eradication of Jews. I'm sure everyone on this call would say, no matter how much those folks, and some of them were very scholarly, insisted that those were faithful expressions of Christianity, they weren't. And so I think we could all hopefully agree on that. So that would be expressions of faith that say that some people aren't really human, that torture and other means or appropriate ways of getting people to do what we want them to do, I think are contrary to the way of Jesus. Now, who gets to decide? Well, I would say that becomes a very communal question on these. So let me give a quick excursus on my view of heresy. A lot of people use the term heresy like it's something that exists in the mind of God. I don't see it that way. I think heresy is a communal category. That is, to be a heretic is to be a part of a community, to know and understand the core commitments of that community, and then with intentionality violate them. So Martin Luther is in fact a Roman Catholic heretic. He knew what the standards, the core convictions of the Catholic Church were, and let's just say, for instance, the authority of the Pope. And he got to the point where he said, screw that. I don't acknowledge the authority of the Pope. In fact, I'm going to burn papal decrees. And he was then at that point cast out of the church, right? And he is a heretic to the Roman Catholic Church. But he's not a heretic for the newly founded Lutheran Church. What the Catholic Church wanted to claim is that because they said he was a heretic, that means that God said he was a heretic because they spoke for God. And I I don't agree with that. I think it's communal. So if you did any research on my book, you will find that some Southern Baptists really hate me and they call me a heretic. And my answer to them is, I can't be a Southern Baptist heretic. I've never been a Southern Baptist in my life. I've never believed in what they believed. I've been a mainline Presbyterian my whole life. And my church doesn't think I'm a heretic. They like me. In fact, when I wrote this book, they liked me even more. So I got the job I have at Second Presbyterian Church, in part because of this book and a lecture I gave when I was being interviewed about this. So now, as different groups wrestle with that, one of the questions becomes, are there ways that we can try to adjudicate our truth claims? And I would say the answer to that is there is a process by which we do that. And when I teach this class that I've taught called Pluralism and Christian Faith at CTS before, we have like 2 weeks, so 6 hours of discussion on what that process looks like, because it's somewhat complicated. But how do you talk about a process of, big word here, epistemic justification, that's justifying our truth claims, while maintaining the perspectival nature of all knowledge? And so rather than try to do that here, I will mention a book if you're interested. It's called Convictions, subtitle Diffusing Religious Relativism, co-authored by James McClendon and James Smith. Now, the fascinating thing about the co-authors of this book is that James McClendon is a Christian and James Smith was an avowed atheist when they wrote the book together. And their point was not that they agreed, they didn't, but that what they shared is a process of a process of communal engagement by which we can justify our religious or other truth claims. I think it's a very helpful book. And what it reminds us is the communities that we choose to participate in are very connected to our identity and our sense of right and wrong in the world. It matters what kind of community you're a part of. And for some people, that means when they realize that, they think, yeah, it might be time for me to find another community. So yeah, I mean, that's the best answer I can give. And of course, we tend to think that our communities, while not perfect, at the core, stand for things that are most helpful in the world.
All right, I've been wrestling with a lot of thoughts, so forgive me if this doesn't fully develop as I talk. But my question, I guess, is in what ways do you believe orthodoxy or how we view heresy need to change for us to have more pluralistic views or values? Because one of the things that you mentioned early on through this discussion was speaking with your friend, your Black pastor friend, who was mentioning integration. And as you had mentioned, that kind of even triggered something into me, because I started thinking, integration is not synonymous with equality, nor is it, or not nor, but it can also be a form of oppression, because like looking at it from the viewpoint of this is a melting pot, or you're integrating, you're changing, you're getting rid of my identity or whatever piece of me is a positive for me, but you're turning that into something that is negative for the community. So I have to conform to what the majority or those in authority have to say about this issue. So when we look back at what you're talking about, the orthodoxy, you know, and getting rid of the Aramaic text and certain things, and this is now the process, you're getting rid of, or you're forcing people to conform to this standard. So then anything outside of it, as a lot of people know, is now heretical. So what do we, going back to the question, what do you think we need to do to take on this more pluralistic view and change how we view this orthodox or our heretical assumptions?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And this is where some of this gets really, you know, at least in my mind, challenging to most traditional churches. So I'll give you a couple of ideas, right? And you know, we can think more about this together and keep wrestling with it. But I'll give you one classic example. Most churches I know, there's generally one person that does most of the preaching. And maybe, you know, you get a guest preacher every now and then. I actually think that that's counterproductive. I think if what we're talking about is true, it is really important to have a multiplicity of voices doing the preaching and teaching in our different churches. And so now people will say, well, I really like this pastor though, because he or she is really good. And my answer is that may be true. It doesn't matter how good somebody is though, they still are one voice. And so one of the things that we have to think about different styles of communication. I think it's one of the challenges of Protestantism, that it became very text and word focused with the advent of the printing press. And so we've gotten into thinking that, you know, the communicated word is the most important way to express the divine. Well, what about art? What about other forms of expression that are also part of that? All right. So I think the challenge is pretty massive. I'm actually kicking around a book called something like The Pluralist Reformation that kind of builds on this and says, how do churches need to change to live into this? Because you can say that you embrace plurality, but if you only have one person doing almost all the teaching, then you're really not living into it. It's what I would call a performative contradiction. So you're saying, you know, performative contradiction is when you say one thing, but you do something else. And so that would be an example of one of the ways that we would need to reimagine things. I think we'd need to rethink what does, what do things like discipleship and evangelism look like in this more pluralistic context? How does the church relate to people in other religious traditions? So yeah, I mean, I think you could go on and on thinking about the implications of this. So in other words, not just the ideas. So I think, you know, the ideas I talk about in the book, but how do we develop context that live into those ideas? And, you know, part of the challenge, I say this at the end of the book, that will be hard for people like me and some of us, you know, who have spent a lot of time getting credentials so that we get the right to stand up and be the ones doing the preaching and teaching. And, you know, but I think getting those credentials also skews our thinking in a certain direction that isn't always helpful. And so hearing from people that don't have lots of education and don't have lots of credentials, but have been faithful participants in the community for a long time, they also have things to say and teach that the rest of us need to hear. So I'll give you a last example. I was in an interview one time, and we're interviewing for an Old Testament position. And I didn't like some of what I was hearing from the candidate. And so I asked the question, what did this individual would think about, should somebody who had been in a particular community for 40 years and participated in everything and was always giving and going to all the Bible studies, listen to all the sermons, could that person be appropriate person to lead a Bible study, even if they didn't have all the background? And, the person's response was, well, those people are great. They're the backbone of the church. We need them and everything, but they can't really teach the Bible because they just won't have the background and the knowledge of all the things that are going on and all the stuff you need to know, and Greek and Hebrew and the historical backgrounds. And I will say I didn't like that answer. I mean, I think those can be valuable tools, and I certainly welcome them. But when we absolutize them and say, you can't really say anything about the Bible or teach or preach it if you don't have all that apparatus behind you, I think is a colossal mistake. And it's another way that we blunt the diversity in the community. And this is a big challenge at my church, because, if you look at and again, don't tell anybody I said this, right? But if I look at my session, the people that lead our church, I know exactly who we're going to pick, in terms of, their social economic status, especially. And so when I nominate people that are less educated and don't have as much money and wealth, somehow they never make it. They never get into leadership. And I think it's another example of the way in which we have, done all kinds of things to blunt diversity. And this, I think, I'll be honest, I think this is as much a problem in the liberal progressive church as it is in the conservative church. So when I came to second and I gave some of this lecture, one of the people said, "Oh, this is really good. You're really challenging those evangelicals." And I said, "Yeah, I think so. I'm also challenging the progressives who, in a lot of ways," this is one of Cone's points. One James Cone's, the chief concern he has weren't conservatives. It was progressives and liberals who said a lot of the right things, but didn't do them. So does that help, James?
Yeah, it helps a lot. It's actually because one of the thoughts I've been wrestling with as well is something that you mentioned about that, how much credentials actually play a part in like wisdom or leading others, because for me at least, I think a lot about from my viewpoint of the heresies that or heretical things like the Nazis or like the KKK or like the dangerous kind of heretical views that the values not only don't match up with what we would believe Jesus is, but also like you're going outside of like this idea of even love your enemies to actually go hurt and kill people. So when I think about that and think about that kind of leadership and where those ideas come from, it's like I wrestle with if credentials even matter in some cases, because there were people with credentials who had those malicious ideas, and there's people without those credentials that have come up with these ideas. So that's something I've always wrestled with, is like, is there even a way to protect the community or ourselves from following a leader with those kind of views? Because I do think there is something to be gained by even those who come to church or read their Bibles on a regular, go to the Bible studies, and they add something, or not just add something, but bring a truth that we may never understand, or we would not understand without them. Kind of going back to Dr. Russell's cartoon in the beginning, it's like that one person is sitting there thinking, wow, God, and the other person is thinking on a whole nother level, maybe in a formula or scientific way, and thinking, wow, God as well. But I would never be able to look at how he's viewing that or she's viewing that on my own. So I need them to express that, or bring that to me and then explain, right?
Yes.
So that is kind of something I like I said, I wrestle with, because my fear is that if there's no way to, I guess, if there's no way to know who's like safe in a sense, to listen to, or who's not going to bring like this maliciousness, then how do we, is there even an orthodoxy, or is there, like, I think it's necessary, but is there a way to frame it or map it for there to be a limit, or to be some safety precautions, not trying to keep anybody and everybody out, but yeah.
I mean, and I think part of that is where community becomes so important, right? And so the community has a role in that. But so I think that's true. Part of the challenge is, I think about, pick on my community, we are so stratified in the Presbyterian Church about these things that it's very difficult to kind of let the kind of diversity emerge that we talk about. So, if I look at the theologians and people teaching in the seminaries, the PCUSA seminaries, we all love diversity. We all love plurality. However, when Pew did a study of the most diverse Christian church denominations in the country, the mainline denominations were at the bottom of the list. The least diverse, the Presbyterian, the PCUSA, the United Methodist, the Episcopalians, the mainline Lutherans. And so it's telling us that even that we're talking these things, but we've developed structures of thinking about community that by their very nature are working against the things that we say we believe. And so, while community is very important, my view is we've got to reform, and it's really hard to do that. And if I'm honest, I ask myself these questions all the time. Do I stay here in this community and keep trying to work to change it, or is it time to do something different? But I feel like, I was baptized a Presbyterian on Easter Sunday, 1962. Don't do the math, thank you. And, so this is my community, and I kind of don't know what else I would do but to keep working for change. But at my age, I'm starting to think the changes I hope for, I'm not likely to see in my lifetime. So what do you do?
Well, I remember Niebuhr. What's Niebuhr?
Which one? Reinhold, Richard?
Reinhold? I mean, what tradition? I mean, he's
He was Reformed.
Reformed, but is that related to the Presbyterian?
Yeah, I think he was Congregational.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, but at any rate, I mean, he says anything worth devoting your life to change is not going to be changed in your lifetime.
Yep.
And it's not like that's okay. Well, then you can give up trying to change. That's not the point.
Right.
And is that we work to change things that we are not dependent upon them getting changed by us or by our efforts. But that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, or because we feel called to do it. And I think that's really important, because it's so easy to get disenchanted or disheartened and discouraged by how slow change is. And the other thing I'd like to say is I do think that there are heresies. I think there are things that are heretical if we're talking about Christianity. I think there's a lot of diversity that's not heretical. So I wouldn't say there's one orthodoxy. I think there's a lot of them, but I mean, a lot of orthodoxy or a lot of perspectives and ways of understanding who God is and acting in the world in accordance with God's will or God's lore or the creative advance or transformation or liberation or however we're naming that, that are consistent with the Christian way of understanding who God is. There are a lot of ways, just as you said, there's an infinite number of numbers between 1 and 10, but 12 isn't one of them. I think it's really helpful for us as you all are studying and learning to become leaders in your church. That doesn't mean that only you get to name this, but I think it's helpful for you to have this kind of reflection and education to be able to be a voice in your community and hopefully a leader in your community for those who are other people who are also leaders, other folks that maybe don't think of themselves as leaders but have been active participants and maybe they need to be tapped for more leadership, but to help them think and reflect upon what it is their core values and to be able to name them in ways that have been critically thought of. And I don't think you have to go to seminary in order to think critically about what it is you believe. But you do have to make the effort to say, do I really believe those things, or am I just saying the same thing every week when I come here because that's what's always been said? Is that?
Yeah.
What do you feel about that? Anybody in the class, including Dr. Franke?
I think it's timely for Methodists right now. Speaking as one of them, and there seems to be that that was telling Dr. Franke when you said that mainline Protestants are at the bottom of that pluralistic, because I grew up thinking that the United Methodists were like this big tent tradition, but then come to find out that was only like maybe half of us that thought that, and the rest have been trying to come back into some sort of strictly defined orthodoxy of what that even means. But I mean, but there is great risk I'm seeing in this, because like when I think of living into a religiously plural tradition, I think of making room for other understandings of things like atonement to come in and take center stage for a little bit. If I had my way, penal substitutionary atonement would be completely out, but that's not true. That's not faithful to this idea. And so, yeah, as a more progressive side, I feel that challenge that you're given to us about making room for even those perspectives that we don't like. Though part of me struggles with the idea of some of those atonement theories being essentially maybe heretical in the fact that they put the Trinity at odds with one another. Though I'm interested in what you think about that with this plural nature of the Trinity, and how is there ever a time when they're at a complete disagreement with one another, or is there room for that, or is that the 12? Within the 6 to 10. So,
yeah, I mean, so I tend to think in classical Trinitarian terms as the Trinity in harmony with itself, with each other in eternity past, right? But that's anthropomorphic language. It's not lost on me, that Jesus prays, let this cup pass from me, there's but not my will. So he's, willing to concede there, but there's some tension. You can chalk that up to the divine, the human side versus the divine side. but yeah, I think who knows how that plays out. I think I'll use the atonement one. I just finished this class at church where I identified 10 different theologies of atonement that have been part of the history of the church and have some rootage in the biblical language, and tried to use that as a sort of a template to talk about pluralism in theology, and that different people don't like different ones of the theories for different reasons. And yet we live with those tensions, right? And so in my own church, I met with different small groups. We're doing that flipping the classroom. So I do videos and study guides, and we have a bunch of small groups, and then I'll pop into the different groups and we'll have good conversation. But inevitably, people in those groups, well, I like this one better, I like that one better. And, we live with that. And try to do the best we can. And now I was clear about what my favorites were. And I'm not a big fan of the substitution one, although the scapegoat, the kind of Rene Girard kind of take on things can be deemed a form of substitution, then that works a little bit better. But yeah, we live with that, and we accept that there will be things that will be part of the makeup of the church that we may not agree with. And I think we have to be able to live with that. And we also have to know the lines where that's not okay, like National Socialism, and things of that ilk. So that's.
So are you saying you live with National Socialism?
No.
Oh.
No, we have to be able to draw the lines where we live with the differences, and then say, and here's a bridge that's too far that we can't live with.
Yeah, and I think criteria are helpful. Like, what are your criteria? Like a criteria that says that some of the children of God are evil or should be killed, or they're excluded by their ethnicity or color, or what's that thing that circumcision thing.
Yeah.
Those are, I think, easy to name. I mean, there might be some things that are harder to name, but to make claims about the equal, that God loves God's children equally, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender or sexuality, regardless of religion, religious practice. And that's something that some Christians have not been able to do. Like, they can go so far, but God likes Jesus followers best. I'm willing to say no. God loves each person, and I think God loves the birds too.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. In that book I mentioned, one of the things they talk about is the criteria for making some of these judgments. But here's an important point. I totally agree with that. And yet here's a challenge, right? So in the Presbyterian Church, like the Methodist Church, we've had a big debate over human sexuality, and can persons in the GLBT community be members of the church? Can they be leaders in the church? And we've come out on a side on that one that, I'm happy with. We say yes to those things. And we have people on the staff at Second who are in that community. But we also have members of our church who don't agree with that. And I would want to say that, while I don't agree with those members of our church who are against that, I also think there is a place for them in that community. And if I look at my own life, I'm thankful for times when I, in my past, didn't think persons in the GLBTQ community could be members of a church or leaders in the church, and that my church didn't kick me out, but people helped me and talked, right? So that became, for me, a means of grace and seeing what I believe to be truth that I might not have arrived at if I had been, unceremoniously kicked out because I didn't affirm those things when they were first affirmed. And I think that's where this sort of approach can be really helpful, because God loves people who believe things that are wrong, and God loves people that do things that are wrong. I preached a sermon at Second Presbyterian Church one time, and I said, it was God loves terrorists. He doesn't love what they do, but he loves the people.
Yeah.
God loves Donald Trump. God loves Hillary Clinton, whichever side you're on, or right? And so, and I know we've got to live into that while we maintain a challenge to those, the things that people do and say that are contrary to the good news. And the great thing about that is we have a canonical example, right? With Paul and Peter in Galatians. Peter knows the gospel. That's not the problem. What Paul's telling him is, when you act the way you do, when the people from Jerusalem show up, you have a performative contradiction that is inconsistent with what you say you believe. And I think, even in the New Testament, we see that same dynamic, that the New Testament in its pages doesn't always live out or bear witness to its deepest truth commitments. So that continues.
I agree with you. Yeah. The inclusion is including people we disagree with. There may be our church has come into how do we deal with persons who have been convicted for certain crimes, particularly if they involve children or youth,
right?
In sexual ways. What do we do with them? Are they not allowed to serve? Are they not allowed to be part of our community? We've decided, yes, they are allowed to be part of our community. They're allowed to serve. They are not allowed to be in situations where they are alone with kids.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's where, stuff gets, because that's the thing you all know, and Helene knows this. And if you've been in leadership very long, you know that finding those things in which everybody in your community agrees upon, especially, are impossible. Right? And so learning how to deal with dissent in ways that affirm your values is really important.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of speak to James' question earlier. Was one of the things, and I assume it's a disciples things, or is that, and we're an open and affirming church, and very social justice active in our community, and our minister is not left out there to do by herself. Our elders are, when we take on being an elder, we are aware that part of that is that we are called to that. So, there are things that our church does that not everybody agrees with. We live in a town where the death penalty happens, and unfortunately happens often here. So we are called on to put signs up and to go to the protests and the prayer visuals for those who, and the church as a church makes that decision as to, if we're involved in that. And not everybody always agrees, because they, as a church, they always, yes, we're going to do it. And so as elders, we're called on to, as someone is voicing things or coming at it in a way that is what we would consider not Christian, coming at it where they're, just bad mouthing, if they're voicing their opinion in an appropriate way, everybody has the right to have their opinion of it. But if they're just bad mouthing and putting people down and being very unchristian about it, it's not just put on the pastor to be the one to say, hey, this isn't okay or whatever. But it's never, there's the front door. It is, let us talk about love. Let us talk about what you're saying, and how does that for you relate to Christ's love and what this church is about? And it is always kind of what Dr. Franke was talking about. It is always, how do we help you see a better way of love. It is never about, oh, you're wrong and that kind of stuff. And so that's how we deal with kind of what you were talking about with the church as a group, and always out of the deepest love for everybody involved.
One of the things for me, just, you know, I don't know why I'm sharing this, but you know, I have, in spite of all the privileges that you get from being ordained, I have decided not to be ordained in my tradition because of some of the stuff I don't agree with. And I suppose I tell myself, yeah, that's you know, I'm not getting some of the tax breaks and things, so it's okay that I'm still hanging in here. But I wrestle with that, right? And that I do appreciate, Helene, that comment from Nibor. That's helpful. You know, that you're pursuing things that you're not going to see changed in your lifetime. I need to keep hearing that because I get frustrated.
It's easy to get frustrated and lose hope.
Yeah.
Us humans like to see results.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yesterday.
That's why we keep the faith together, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to keep the faith together. Yeah. Any more questions for Dr. Franke? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Franke. We really appreciate you coming and visiting with us and sharing your wisdom and inspiring conversation and some really wonderful things to think about and to reflect upon. And thank you so much for writing your book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
My pleasure.
I love having the kind of combination and to see some of the differences between, that's ink, the differences between, they're not all that many differences between what you're saying here as an evangelical and the multiplicity that you find in the biblical text and in the tradition, and what Marjorie Suhaki is going to say for next week when we're talking about the religious pluralism, not only within Christianity, but beyond Christianity, and how thinking about who God is and what truth is with a capital T or a small t, how those things are related for you. For you, Dr. Franke, and then how each of us comes to understand how those are related for us in our tradition or our community.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and let me quick add here. I mean, I fully affirm the plurality of other religious traditions as well as something that is also God intended. But my thesis in the book was, and the reason I focused on the Christianity is, if Christians can't get comfortable with the plurality in our own house, we're never going to be okay with plurality outside our doors. So yeah. I'll also mention my latest book came out just past November called Missional Theology, an Introduction, where I try to take these things and tie them to the mission of God. So check it out.
okay, who's it published with?
Baker Academic.
Baker Academic. Okay, that's great. Missional Theology.
It's called Missional Theology and Introduction.
An introduction.
Yep.
Yeah, here, well, let's post it on there.
So let's see.
Okay, I posted it on there so people can.
There it is. Perfect. Yep.
Yeah, I think I got it right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. You know, although I just want to say one more thing.
Sure.
And I know everybody's got to pee, but I think for some folks, it's easier to acknowledge diversity outside of their own religion than it is within their own. I mean, I get that. I think they're interconnected, but for some folks, it's easier to say, oh yeah, people from other communities, other cultures over there in India, they've got some other religions and that's great for them. Right? I mean, I've heard people say that, but this is what Christianity is. And so if you want to be Christian, you have to affirm this. I'm not sure what to make of that, but I have seen it. So,
yeah.
So kind of like two approaches, one from inside and one from outside.
Right.
I think is helpful to go there. Would be
Yeah,
interesting
definitely.
to class together.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of religious pluralism within Christianity and without.
That would be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, would be.
So tomorrow, Helene, we're going to do the same thing.
Yes.
Yep. So
Is that
what
good?
time? I have 6:15, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Will you start at 6 o'clock and do this?
6.
So I'll get on at 6 then. I like
Okay.
being part of that. Okay.
We'll do it. We'll do something similar, although people will ask different questions.
Okay. Yep.
All right.
Great.
Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Peace to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And everyone else, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break. Actually, let's just come back at 3 p.m. Okay, does that give everybody enough time to use the necessary and stretch your legs and all of that? Are there any other questions before we go? Okay, we'll see you at 3 p.m.
How are you guys doing, Zach?
Good. How are you, Jackie?
Good. I forgot to shut the door. My husband's in the other room working. He probably doesn't want to hear about all of the topics of today.
Why not? I would.
1 second. You have a new location yet?
No, I'm as far as I know, I'm staying put. So for the time being, they my PPRC asked me to reconsider and said, "Hey, we'll." It kind of sounds like they'll pick up the slack, but what it really means is they will take back the things they should have been doing. To begin with, some of the responsibilities that I have been shouldering, it's really been them that should be doing some of these things. Like, yeah, I don't need to be the one who is calling all of the financial meetings. I don't need to be the one who is calling the remote giving firm, in the middle of the week if there's an issue. Those are things that volunteers volunteer for, so I don't need to write. Yeah,
I say that back, so good job. Good job putting your foot down or whatever happened.
Yeah, I started to think about it. I was like, well, what could I be giving up here that I couldn't be, that somebody else could be doing that I don't need to necessarily be doing? Well, I could be not working on, I could not be the one to upload all of the videos every Sunday, after the service, things like that. That could be done by our production people. Somehow it had fallen to me. So yeah, it's an exercise in delegating and learning what delegation actually is, because when I give some of that stuff away, it feels like I'm not doing anything, but really it just frees me up to do the stuff that I'm supposed to be doing. So
yeah,
but cool. Yeah, but when that's the culture of the church, and that's been the culture of every church that I've been in, it's almost like reimagining what the position is, because this has been it for so long, because before I came to this one, I did all the yearly paperwork. It was just because nobody else was using a computer, because that was the culture of the church. And all of our finance stuff was written out by hand. I mean, it was, yeah. I mean, yeah. So it was an alternate reality, I guess, to what it really should be. So, yeah.
Well, welcome everyone back. What would a religiously plural church truly look like? Good question. I need, before Zach tells us all about that, are there any other questions about that gives you a few minutes to come up with it, Zach? Any other questions about Dr. Franke's book or presentation? I appreciate the questions that you all gave, and I just find him such an interesting dialogue partner, because clearly, he loves Barth and I love Kierkegaard, and I'm a process first theologian and he's not, and we just have some really interesting theological conversations with each other, having some fundamental agreements about diversity, and what does that word even mean? Often it has become something everybody talks about, but what do they really mean by it? But I mean, really having an openness to a variety of perspectives that can all be part of orthodoxy, or I don't even like the word orthodoxy, but can all be considered non-heretical and worthy of being voiced and redemptive. So that's been an interesting journey. We've had an interesting journey together as I've gotten to know him better as he's come to Indianapolis the last 3 or 4 years. Anyone have any other comments or questions?
Hey, could I ask a question?
Please.
So what, especially as it relates to this conversation, what differentiates a process thinker from a systematic thinker?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So I think that there are process thinkers that are primarily wouldn't characterize themselves as systematic. So I can only speak for me, I guess. So what I can say for me is that I don't think of myself as a systematic theologian, although I'm teaching systematic theology in the fall, and I'm thinking some of you might be taking that. Yeah, maybe anybody raising their hand? Yeah, so some of you should take it. If you haven't, Zach, you're not taking it? You should take it.
I didn't have enough room. I'm sorry. I will eventually.
Nice to take the intro and then take the systematic right after that. That's kind of a nice sort of, but at any rate, is that I'm more of a constructive theologian, by which I mean, I think that theology, the different elements of theology. So let me say this. The thing I like about systematic theology is that it assumes that all elements of a theological system are related. In other words, what one believes about who God is and God's mission, God's purpose, God's understanding of why did God create the world and what does God hope for the world is related to the way in which how we understand who Jesus is and how we understand who God is and God's purpose in creating the world and engaging with the world and Jesus's purpose in being part of the world and in some ways effecting redemption or some way I'm trying to say this as broadly as possible, right? So it includes all the different ways of understanding the significance of who Jesus is in the world. How is that then related to who we are and how we sometimes fail at getting the idea of what God wants from us, right? So how you understand, does that make sense what I'm saying? So how you understand what's the creation about? How are you related to who God is at the moment of your creation, your birth? And how do you not live up to that, whether that's through missing the mark or whether that's through a more Calvinist view of being
Depraved?
yeah, that's it, depraved. Thank you. Or if it's more of a not really, more of an ignorance or more of a falling short of what is expected or what is hoped for that you can do. All of those understandings of how people are not living up to what God would like us to be are related to what Jesus does for us. So if you think that you're not living up to your potential, but you're getting close, then Jesus dying to save you from the sin of depravity isn't like, if you don't think you're depraved, you don't need Jesus to be tortured in order to save you from being depraved, right? So if the idea of what it means to be human is don't quite got it, you don't quite understand it, then Jesus's wisdom is very important, because Jesus is going to reveal and help you develop the wisdom that you have into a deeper understanding of who God is. Does that help? Right? So
Yeah.
So constructive theology then wants to have that element, continue that element of the relationship between the whole system of how your theology is interrelated to itself, within itself, and it's how your understanding of God and the world and human purpose and human the goal of human life and the goal of all life. Why did God create life? All of that is consistent Then constructive theology also sees that it is distinct in different communities, different times, right? So the constructiveness is an openness to what are the problems and the questions of today, of your community, of your nation, and how God answers those, as opposed to here's what. So often people, when they say systematic theology, there are 5 answers, and you've got to figure out which one of those is the way you understand who God is, or the way you understand what sin is, or the way you understand what Jesus is. And if you pick A in category 1, you also have to pick A in category 2, 3, and 4. Constructive theology is much more of there's an openness to the variety of different ways in which people express and articulate those questions, and really sees this connection between the human need and desire, the longing for God's presence in a healing way, in a redemptive way, in a liberating way, in a transformative way, as related and unique to who you are and what your community is going through and what the questions are that you have, and that then God is more of an answering theology. Often constructive theology is more open to engaging other approaches to knowledge, to experience, to understanding experience, to understanding, for example, what's the difference between male and female, ways of knowing, ways of affirming what is the case for them, which is, you notice that the different words and different framework then figuring out what's true, right? Affirming what is the case for me and my community is different. It's making a different assumption than figuring out what's true, which the tradition, the white male tradition, or they're not even all white male. There's a lot of Africans in the beginning, Northern Africans in the beginning of the Christian tradition. And then there's a lot of Europeans, and most of them are men coming up with what is the truth. And usually there's one truth. And if you don't believe with that one truth, then you're a heretic, as we were discussing, right? And if this is the one truth, then what follows from that will be, this is the one truth. This is the one truth about sin. This will be the one truth about who Jesus is. Or often what happens is, this is the one truth about who Jesus is, thus sin must be understood in this way, which is kind of backwards, I think. But that is backwards because constructive theology is saying, well, what is it that people need? What is it that's going on? And how does God answer that and help us? A little, probably more than what you actually wanted, right?
No, it's not actually. That was very helpful because I was having a problem in my mind. You had mentioned thinking through process. So I leapt to the assumption that then John Franke must have been systematic, because I was not considering that there was such a thing as constructive theology. And so I was having problems. It seems you guys think very similarly about things. So I was having trouble in my own mind trying to categorize how things you guys are thinking about what was talked about today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that his view in the book that he wrote has been transmuted a little bit, or it's changed a little bit. And I think it's interesting that he's writing something about all faiths or all religions, which I think is the next step from what he did with Christianity. And Suhaki, and my view, which is similar to Suhaki, and we'll read about that next week and the week after, is looking at a paradigm that fits both how we understand who we are as Christians, but not just let's go in a cave and be by ourselves and talk about what it means to be Christian, and then go out and talk about how then we're related to all the other religions. Suhaki is looking at, we're in a big world, and how do we affirm what we believe as Christians in a way that does not disaffirm or condemn or judge as wrong or heretical. Heresy doesn't even work, just wrong, that what other religions have affirmed. And how do we come up with a model or understanding of truth and a ethic and a understanding of the mission, our mission, that's consistent with those ways of how we understand who God is, or how we understand what truth is about. So I've got a little PowerPoint here, but let me see, where's this thing? Share screen. Here's a little whiteboard. Okay. So I would say the difference between my view and Franke's view is that for him, this is the truth. And it's got a big T. A big T. Okay. And then there's Christians. I mean, in the book he's written that we're using in this class, he's talking mostly about Christians. He's talking about only about Christians and the Christian tradition, Christian scripture. So there's Christians, and they have small t's. That looks more like a plus, but it's supposed to be a T. It's a T that's been corrected. So they're all looking toward the big T, but nobody quite gets to it. You get what I'm writing, what I'm doing here. It's harder to draw with your finger than it is with a marker. Right? And maybe some folks get some things about the big T more closely consistent with the big T than others. Right? Process's view is that there's these are actually I should do it like this. Wait, how do I do this? Is there an eraser? Okay. Oops. Oops. Try to draw. Where's the draw button? No, it's supposed to be a draw. Shit. Excuse me. Will that work? Okay, that'll work. All right. Right. So there are a whole bunch of these, and there is T. Well, there's God. Right. And there's different views of God and different relationships with God. And the T's are really in that relationship because they're T is relational, right? And it's not that it might be that if you put all these T's together, you get close to a bigger T, but there's no one big T. It's more like there's a bunch of these big T's, I mean, little T's, I should say. That God is so vast and diverse that God includes all, because God relates to each religion and each community. And there is a truth in the relationship. But my relationship with God and a Buddhist's relationship with that which they think is divine or ultimate are going to be different. They're going to look different. And it's not this is, I mean, in some ways, I think with Suhaki, if you could possibly add all these T's together, you'd get closer to the big T. but the big T would not be a circle, right? The big T would be diverse within itself. Any questions about that? My battery's dying. I have to go inside. I'm sorry. So I know it's not the best drawing, but it's any questions before I turn it off?
The relationship then back to God, to us, then is there's like a mutual exchange, I think. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
What we do affects God. Does that mean that obviously we influence God? I'm trying to think of how to ask the question. Does that mean that change? It doesn't necessarily change the dynamic of. There's something eternal about God still, isn't there? Or is it?
Yeah. So let me stop sharing, and now let me share this. So can you all see that? Yes. Okay. So this is my presentation, and when I get to God, it's like this. So God is more like, I mean, it's an interesting drawing, and it's not meaning to say that God is Korean or I Ching or something like that, but it is a nice way of saying that there's a primordial nature of God. Nice, it's not way of saying, it's a nice way to illustrate. There's a primordial nature of God and a consequent nature of God. So the primordial nature of God, Whitehead's book is called Process and Reality. So the primordial nature of God is the part of God that is not changing. It is the unchanging love, creativity, God's love and goodness. God is about the best possibility. God is about what is most helpful for all of us, novel possibilities, inclusive nature of God. God's giving all of this to creation, but God doesn't just thrust it upon creation. God gives it individually as actual entities. We're actual entities, but so is Tangelo. So is plants. I mean, so there's a more of a. It's not completely pan psychism, but there is a panness to it in this, because pantheism. It's more of a. God is engaged with all creation, not just with humans. God engages with humans in a different way than God engages with birds, but God is also engaging with birds, if that makes sense. So there's this primordial nature of God, which is the source of some of the possibilities, the novelty that God sends or suggests in our pre-conscious awareness. And then there's the consequent nature of God. And that's the aspect of God that receives from creation. It's affected by creation's decisions, whether we make whether we have sinful decisions, whether we're failing, whether we're loving, whether we're life-giving. God is affected, and what God then gives to us in from the primordial nature in this lure is partially dependent on the decision that we've made. Does this make sense? Okay, how do I get back? I don't know how this works. Okay, stop share. Let me share it again. How about that? Let me just go through this where'd you guys go? You guys left me. There you are. Okay. Somebody had a question. Panentheism. Yes, it is panentheism. So it's not pantheism, right? It's not everything is God. It's panentheism, which means God is, wait, how do I do this?
Is it to say that God is present in everything?
God is present in everything, but God is beyond that as well.
Right.
So here, let me do this again. This is where I wish I had a chalkboard. Okay, so it means that okay, this is a bad earth, but it's supposed to be earth. Okay, and then this is God. Okay, so in a Calvinist view, God just sort of interacts with God, with the earth. That's it, right? And the earth is affected by that. In a process view, God includes the earth, but is also bigger than the earth, right? So God is bigger than what the earth contributes. And there's a part of the earth that also is not controlled by God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sometimes I get it mixed up.
Yeah. So the book Creating Women's Theology, which is something that Monica Coleman, Nancy Howell, and I wrote, includes both sections from each of us, but then also sections or smaller sections from different process theologians that are women on different topics. And it's an argument that the way that women do process theology is slightly different than the way that men have done it. And mostly I think it's because we want to talk about it as relational theology and include not just the Whiteheadian stuff, although Whitehead is certainly a foundation of how we understand the metaphysics. So the idea here is that traditional classical theology is based on a metaphysics that's pretty outmoded. It's based on the Plato and Neoplatonic thought that Plotinus and Augustine and Aquinas and Aristotle were all engaged in and used to create a system of understanding reality, kind of merging or melting or creating an integrated view of who God is and how the world and God are related and how humans are involved in it. But it is a Greek metaphysics, and a Greek metaphysics that is static. God's not static. Actually, God's beyond static or dynamic. So when we look at God, God's static because we're static. We can only reach certain ideals, and those ideals are in us to begin with, and then they fall as we fall. Remember the fall. We are kind of blinded to what those insights are, those awarenesses of the true ideals. And you remember the cave and Plato and all of that. I hope everybody's familiar with that. We can only see the shadows of what actually is real. And what's actually real is imprinted, or we have an access to it in our mind, but it's not our brain. It's our mind that is structured by the structure of reason. And we have to we've forgotten it in the fall. And we have to get back to that. And we get back to the ideals, according to Plato, by asking questions and reflecting upon what it is we know. And, so what is justice? What is beauty? So you see something that's beautiful and you reflect, what is that? And so it's a very idealism that is spawned by the world and what you see in the world, but what's really real are the ideas and ideals. So, and that then came together with the biblical view, and biblical views are not there. There's little bits here and there that kind of fit with that, but not completely. So anyway, that's the construction of classical theology. And there's different elements where the theologians who are creating it, constructing it, like Augustine and Aquinas, move more toward the biblical view of God. And there's other times when they move more toward the philosophical views of this principle, this divine principle. So what process theology does is it comes in and says, this outdated metaphysics is not helpful, but a metaphysics is helpful. So they come up with the notion that Whitehead did. Well, actually, they don't. They're just influenced by Whitehead. Whitehead came up with a new metaphysics, and it's a metaphysics that's based on the organicness of that all of reality is an organism, that it's all interrelated with itself, and particularly humans and life on Earth is all interrelated, and God is engaged with all creatures and all reality. And so I'll go forward because this book here is looking a little bit at, what then do we mean by women's understanding of this? So women's understanding of it, and this is more process theology, actually, process theology in general, is that God is relational. As I drew that, or had that I Ching, the God is both relational, but God is also beyond being completely shaped by relationships with all actual entities, but particularly with us. And maybe there's other worlds in which God is related with other entities that are intelligent and make moral decisions, often badly, like us, but maybe they make them better than we do. I don't know. So God is relational with each of us, and we are made up of all of our relationships with others. Does that make sense? Does that feel with anybody's experience that we are made up of relationships with others, with our own past, and especially with God? And for process thought, the future is open. It's not pre-described, predestined. It's more like jazz because it's improvisational. It's God's creation is like improv, right? And those of you who have heard an actual improv, you might have heard a recording of it, but that's just recording of what was improvisational then, but actually being there in live music. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to be in the pandemic without actual live music, is if it's jazz, it goes in whatever direction is the musicians are feeling. And that may have something to do with the energy that's in the bar or in the room or in the jazz club. It may have something to do with the energy between them. It may have something to do with the mood of the whole community. The one person will start to play a kind of melody and will take off on that. Another person will kind of pick up on that. That's a model of thinking about how process theology sees the relationship between God and humans and each other. It's kind of improv. So God's the leader and offers suggestions. And it's not just like, okay, there's 5 options here. We can do this, this, this. It's more like it happens organically. Like you like that note? Does that note do anything for you? And it's not even a question. It's more like phew, like, oh, that makes me want to say this, right? So it's more like that kind of movement. There's freedom, there's dynamism, there's what Whitehead often says is indeterminate, right? It's not determined. Now, when we say freedom, as Americans, we usually think of a pretty conscious decisiveness, but for process theology, it's even below that conscious decisiveness. It could include some conscious decisiveness, but it also includes the way that water drips, the way that rain falls. It's indeterminate. It's not, I mean, you can predict that piece right here will eventually get wet, but I don't know if you've ever been in a rainstorm where there's just bit drops, right? And you're driving down or you're sitting in the car or something, you got windows, and you see there's a drop there, a drop there. I mean, there's no pattern. It's not a set pattern, right? It just happens. And it's more like that, right? We are free, and reality is indeterminate. It moves in ways that is not predetermined, or it responds and acts in ways that are not predetermined. We are able to decide and respond to the past, whether that's our own past or another past, or we're also able to respond to God's lure. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Another element, so in addition to relationality, the notion is becoming, not a static being. We're all in the process of becoming. We're all free. There's a freedom and indeterminate. So thus, there isn't just a being. And it's not just, oh, there's a structure that we're trying to get to, but rather there is a becoming. We're becoming who we're becoming. Not we're becoming who we should be. We're not, but we're being what we have become. Like, so once you've become, like 3 minutes ago, that being is past, and it is determined because it's happened. But the next moment, it's not determined. You're in the process constantly of being in the present moment, moving forward. And this process of becoming is very much a function of our own decisions and our own sensibilities, but also our relationships with others and our relationships with God. How accustomed are you to listening to the lure of God's possibilities? I mean, I was always reminded of Jiminy Cricket. I don't know if anybody saw the Jiminy Cricket thing, where Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio are talking. And, how do you know what your conscience is saying? Well, you have to almost establish a habit of listening to if you ignore it long enough, you won't hear it anymore, right? So it's, and I think of it less as when I was a little kid, I used to think of it as a voice within, and now I think of it more as an embodied reality. Like, if I just listen to my body, what's my body telling me? What is my body communicating to me? Oh no. Okay, he's turning around. For a second there, I thought he was coming here. I don't know if you can hear the fire engine. Anyway, so listening to the body can tell us things that we're consciously ignoring, or we've been consciously ignoring. We can say, I'm not anxious. No, I'm not anxious at all, right? But we can, if we listen to the body, and actually sometimes listening to the body is what we need to do, and then the anxiety can be dissipated. Like the anxiety might actually be your body saying, you're not listening to me. I'm saying this. I'm saying this. Okay, I'm just going to have to say it really loud, right? In some ways, I think of it as God's lure being felt in our bodies as well as in our minds. Creativity, which includes novelty, is definitely a value in process theology. It's the divine lure is offering a new way of doing things. Now, we often choose the same way we've been doing things, but there are times when we choose a new way. We do something slightly different. we become slightly different than we have been in the past. Process theology in Whitehead says this is true about all reality, but it's particularly true about living creatures, living entities, and humans who have even more conscious decision-making ability than, I was going to say birds, but birds can be, the bird that I know has a lot of conscious decision-making, although she has a lot of habits as well. But grass, flowers, they change. And for Whitehead, they're making decisions. Like, they're not making decisions the way we make decisions. There's an indeterminates about how tall that flower is going to go. It can't be figured out with math. Anyway, so that's the process view of focusing on relationality and focusing on becoming, not static being, and then creativity. So for process, the big thing is creative advance. There's a creative advance. The world and God are in a creative advance and a dance of creative advance. It's an overarching value. It's also the password if you go on the process and reality page and you want to get to articles, creative advance. God lures us into deeper, more intense, harmonious, creative, and life-giving decisions. So so you notice that harmony is helpful, not sameness, but harmony. Beauty for Whitehead and Whitehead's understanding is, and God is in the business of beautifying. And beautifying is not adding colors or putting on, makeup. It's transforming conflict into contrast. And I think that's particularly important in the conversation we've had about when we were talking about heresy versus diversity, right? Where conflict is heresy. Now the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, they don't think Martin Luther is a heretic. They did think he was a heretic, but now he's not. Now he's a contrast, right? So that there's been healing, that conflict that was life defying, right? They wanted to have him killed. And they wanted his followers to be excommunicated, if not destroyed, now has become contrast. So it's not that they're the same, but there can be a kind of harmony or a kind of harmonious disagreements. So God's creativity is the source of novelty, and our creativity incarnates that novelty. There must be a big fire because there's a lot of them going by. Okay, sorry, I had to say a little prayer there. God's hope for the world and God's lures and God's luring us. And it's not just, so for process, there's a sense of here's the moment drawing this way. And then there's also a kind of superject toward the future, even as the moment is happening. This advancing, the idea is to advance and process and progress toward greater inclusivity, greater beauty, adding to everyone. So the many become the one. The conflict is transformed into contrast and then are increased by one. The many become one and are increased by one. So an intensity, and an intensity cannot be pleasant, especially at the dentist's office, right? But at least you're feeling something, right? So intensity is valued, although it's not always pleasant. For Whitehead, intensity is better than ho-hum. Any questions about any of this so far? I realize I'm going kind of fast. So we've talked a little bit about this before, but this notion is a becoming, not static being. So each and every entity is in this process of becoming, and we're becoming as an organicness together. We're not, I'm becoming, you're becoming, and next week we'll see how we've become. No, we're all becoming, right? And we're influenced by each other. And process does think that we're influenced by those entities that we spend more time with and are closer to us, but we are also influenced by, perhaps unconsciously, things that are far away from us. That notion about wind blowing in the other part of the world, in India, having an impact upon our weather is process theology. We're an organism together. God is an organism. God and the world come together. It's not God versus the world. It's God and the world. God is, without the world, God is not God. And the world means universe. It's not just like if the earth is not here, God's not God. It's the universe. So this actuality, God's possibility, and we're actuality. So scripture in process theology understanding is calling us toward that which is holy. And most process theologians, William Beardsley was a New Testament scholar who was also a process theologian. When I was in Claremont, he's passed now, but for him, he would talk much about how scripture is contextual and communal, and our interpretations and enactments in relation to scripture are in the process of becoming as we relate to each other. We also are relating to our past, and we're relating to God's lure, which God's lure is luring us toward a future that's complex, intense, beautiful, creative, advancing toward harmony. That's a long sentence. So I hope, are there questions about that?
It's not a question, but when you mention God's lure, it reminds me of Coleman and how she was explaining like the persuasive nature of God.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I'm talking about what she's saying. Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha. And I guess how that, from what she was saying, how that interacts with us being or having free will and not having free will and making those choices. And then because if God was not persuasive in nature, she was saying that we would be more like puppets in a way, like if God already knew what we were going to do, not that he's not all knowing, but that because we have the options of choice, that I'm putting this into my own words.
Yeah,
God can see the options that we have. He doesn't know exactly what we're going to choose out of those options, but then in making our choice, he's trying to persuade us to a certain choice, but by making a choice, we then, in our relationship with God, change that trajectory with God.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so Suhaki, when we get to Suhaki next week, the difference between Suhaki and John Cobb and Coleman is somewhere in the middle, I think. I think she more follows Cobb in some ways. But so for Cobb, there is a divine lure, divine persuasion. There's one option that is better than others. Now, unfortunately, or less bad than others. Because sometimes you're in a situation where there's really no good option, right? But which one is less worse or less bad? Less worse. That's not really, that doesn't work. You know what I mean? But sometimes there's more than one good option, right? So for Suhaki, she's allowing there's several options, and they lead to good things. There might be some other options that don't lead to positive things or harmony, but there may be more than one good option or option that leads toward harmony and creativity and advancement. I mean, if you think about like, what do you want to, which movie do you want to go to? Or, to be more life decisions. I mean, what's the difference? Is it a better option for you to move toward medicine or toward ministry or toward studying neurobiology? I mean, any of those might be good options, right? And it's not like there's just one right answer. So the idea, sometimes people think, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to pray and God will tell me what the right answer is. This notion is there's more than one right answer. There's more than one good option, which is much better than there's more than one bad option. But there's a multiplicity of, or a mininess of decisions that can be made that are not sinful. It's not just that if you make this decision, even though you make the decision to be a medical doctor instead of the decision to be a pastor, that somehow that's a sin. I mean, one might argue that if you have a special calling. So maybe pastor should be, let's take pastor out. But so you could be a medical doctor, or you could be someone who studies neurobiology in the lab. One decision might not be a sin and the other one be good, right? So does that help? Or does it make more muddy? It's just a clarification or a individual distinction.
I think it makes sense because one of the things that my church has talked about before, and we even brought it up recently in one of my ministries, that secular is not, how do we say it? Secular is not the opposite of sacred. Like that, not everything secular is bad per se, or there's no, going to your point, it's like you can have multiple choices and it's not inherently bad or evil just because it's not considered holy or sacred. So, if I want to listen to R&B music and they don't mention God in the music, it's not that it's a terrible thing. They can still be something about love or relationships, and it just be about love and relationships. So that's kind of what I get out of that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good example. Yeah. So I already talked about this notion of God having two natures, one being unchanging, the primordial nature, and then the consequent nature. The consequent nature is always growing and changing, really. And then there's process relational feminism. So this is just a summary of what Nancy Howe was talking about. And these are just the elements that she mentioned that she develops more intently in the rest of her article or introduction, right? So the notion that experience is more fundamental than a system. Like, what are people's experience? What are people's current experience? What are people's past experience? And how do we engage with each other's experience? Like, can we have collective experience? And what's that? How do we engage with that? And then experience can also be over time, right? You might have a momentary experience, but that was a momentary experience. And the next time you went to that place or did that thing, you didn't have that experience, right? But you have an experience that you continually have a sense of something is happening when I do these, when I go into take communion at my church, which I haven't done in so long, I can't remember it, but I have a renewed experience of God's presence in an embodied way, right? So experience is not just in the moment, but it is, the idea is that it's more fundamental than the system, which can be abstract. And here's what you're supposed to feel, or here's what you're supposed to do, or here's what you're supposed to think is true. But what does your experience tell you, which could be embodied experience as well. Particularity, and this is the one I love. This is also Kierkegaard. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about love. And that is that particularity reflects reality better than universalism. That we are all individual and we're all particular. You notice he talks about, when he talks about the particularity of love, it's not that you have this universal love of humankind. Rather, you have particular love, works of love for individuals. That's love. I hope that makes sense. And then there's praxis or practical engagement over abstractions. So what you learn in the practice of Christianity, and how you practice what it is that you believe is true and good, rather than abstractions. The practice is it's not more true, but it's it tells us more than simple abstractions does. It's more revealing about who we are and who God is and what we're called to do. There's an organicism rather than a dualism. So you remember Whitehead talks about God as this organism. There's an organism notion that there's a wholeness that is not simply a dualism, or it's not simply even a trinity. It's a inclusion of all these different ways of being. And sorry, there's this beautiful bird out there that keeps coming, and he's new, or she's new. So it distracts me, but it's big. Anyway, okay. So this organicness, right? This thinking about the whole organism, the whole, the earth as a whole organism. And when you've got some part of the earth that's suffering and sick, it eventually is going to affect the whole earth. We think we can just be isolated over here, right? But we can't be, according to process theology. Nature is not just persons. No, nature is valuable, not just persons, right? So it's not just about, God doesn't just love people, right? But God loves nature too. And God is also incarnate in nature in ways that maybe you wouldn't use the word incarnate, but present, right? God reveals God's self in nature as well as in individuals. There's also an openness to dialogue with science. Science could be a source of theology. Science tells us things about the nature of what it means to be human. It tells us things about the nature of our earth. It tells us things about, what's COVID up to, right? Science, it tells us, can give us good information. And then there's the engagement with other religious perspectives as dialogue partners. And that's the one that Suhaki's book on divinity and diversity, which we will talk about next week, is going to focus on and develop. Next week, any questions about that? I can post that. Oh, and then I already talked about that. Okay. I can post that if you'd like me to post that. And next week, we're going to talk about Suhaki's book, Divinity and Diversity. And I want to remind you that in the Populi, there is a study guide or kind of a summary of what she's saying in her book, the different chapters. I've created a kind of outline for the lecture. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to have your opportunity to, how do we get to that? Have the opportunity to give presentations. You don't just have the opportunity, you're supposed to give presentations. So did everybody see that? Does anybody have any questions about that? You know, I'm going to suggest that you can kind of sign up if you want to talk about that now. I mean, we can sign up now if you want to talk about that before the week beforehand. I mean, sometimes people like to do that. Other times they say, oh, I'd like to do that, but that they probably won't. But here's the idea. So somebody will do the chapter on the reign of God. Someone will do the chapter on the saving grace, and someone will do the chapter on pluralistic world. Oops, here. It has the, all right, that's not working. All right, anyway, so do folks want to talk about, do you want to sign up now, or do you want to talk amongst yourself and figure that out? Okay, well, I'm figuring this out.
Is this a group presentation?
Yeah, they'll be in twos because there's 6 of you. So who wants to, so we could just say which 2 people want to do the chapter on the reign of God, which 2 people want to do the chapter on saving grace, which 2 people want to do the chapter on mission and pluralistic world.
I'll volunteer for grace.
Okay.
I'll volunteer for pluralist. Yeah, say it, the pluralistic world.
Okay, let me write that down. We got Mary Beth doing pluralistic world. And then we've got Zach doing saving grace. Anybody else?
I guess I'll jump on to the reign of God.
The reign of God. All right, James.
I think I'm interested in, well, I guess I'm a little confused, to be honest. I'm not sure. Can I do chapter on mission in a pluralistic world, or is that not what I have to do something else?
No. There's 2 people for each.
Oh, it doesn't matter what group you're in.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
So you and Mary Beth will get together and you'll talk about how you want to present the chapter on the mission in a pluralistic world.
Okay, I misunderstood. Okay, that's that.
Sorry, I was probably not very clear.
I'll take Grace with Zach.
Who was that?
Jackie.
I just can't see you now. Okay, and then James, you'll be working with our friend. What's her name?
Terea.
T-E-R, Terea. I might be spelling it right. Terea.
I think it's T-O-R-E-Y-A.
Thank you.
Is there
Having a little brain fart there for a second.
is there any chance you're going to give us a little time next week in class to get our partner, or do we need to
Well,
arrange?
you should go ahead and contact each other, and you should have those emails. I mean, if you don't have each other's emails, let me know. But you should have those emails. Do you want me to, does anybody have concern about that? No? Okay. You got to talk to me because I can't see you. I can see you now, but I couldn't see you before because I was trying to figure all that out. Okay. So, I mean, some of you might want to say, oh, okay, well, I mean, so my suggestion is you read the chapter, that you kind of go over what she's getting at. You look at maybe the study guide, and then you read the chapter, and you think about, then you want to get together with your person and say, here's what I'd like to do, and here's what I think we should do. And, you can be creative if you want to be, please.
Okay.
Okay, and I realize we're after 4, so I'm going to let you go. But if anybody has any questions, please let me know. All right, and I appreciate the great questions that you had for our Dr. Franke, and the engagement with process theology here, and hope it was clear. All right, I'll talk to you all next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.